Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me on this Wednesday afternoon. I usually go live on Sundays, but last weekend was Easter, so I thought we'd go live a little bit later. So today is actually an audience live Q&A, which means that all the content for this stream will be taken from you. So if you want to submit a question, I would love that. And you can just go to the link that's provided in the chat, and that will bring you to my website where there's a submission form. And that is where you can submit your questions. And those will be selected for today. So we've had the form open for already an hour and they're already pouring in. So let's start. Let's see what you have to say. So the first question is actually from Logan. And Logan, you asked, when teachers such as Abraham Hicks say they're channeling, are they actually in contact with a higher being? So I'm going to leave that discernment and analysis to you as to whether or not you think that a teacher or someone is channeling something good or bad. I think that that has to be a process of discernment within yourself. But what I can say is that just because someone is channeling, which I think this is the real discussion underneath any question about anybody being legitimate, is that it is a reality that any person, who is psychic can tune into anything. You can tune into the lower astral plane, and you can tune into a demonic entity. You can tune into spiritual masters, angels, and higher consciousness as well. So, just because somebody is psychic and saying things that are, sounding positive or providing some relief of mental anguish, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're connecting to the highest source, right? And this is sort of the journey of every student, is to figure out whether or not a teacher is legitimate or not, because many times also teachers can be caught up in things and not realize that they're channeling from an entity or a stream that is not of the highest good. So this is just one of the difficult things that can only really be solved through the development of higher consciousness within humanity. You cannot intellectually, decide whether or not something is true spiritually. You have to actually gain the senses, the spiritual sensitivity and the abilities to look into the astral plane, to see, to feel, to know these things, because you cannot know them simply by intellectual analysis, just like you would like look at an atom under a microscope, or biological entity and learn its patterns. You have to develop a certain way of perception for that. And so that is the whole point, is to be able to discern that. Now, I think that in when it comes to Abraham Hicks, I think a lot of that is on manifestation, which I think has some powerful points, but I think can very easily get turned into, how do I make the world my personal catalog to almost make the physical world my heaven. So it's sort of like very much the kind of spiritual perspective we had in the early 2000s and the 90s, things like that, all about manifestation. Whereas personally, and this is a matter of taste for me, I'm not trying to make a statement on the quality of someone or the truthfulness of someone. But for me, the kind of teachings that are more rich and more powerful and meaningful are actually learning spiritual science, actually learning cosmology, actually learning about anthropogenesis, actually learning the spiritual science of the world. And with that learning, everything about manifestation comes, everything about everything you could want comes from just learning basically the occult science of the spiritual world. So that's what I would focus on. And that also really can clear up just trying to, focus on certain things. It's better to learn the entire science of spirit overall. Okay, this one is from Iris. Hi, Gigi. I have to say, I really love your work. Thank you, Iris. Today I read in one lecture, quote, Lucifer has a powerful influence over our ideals, unquote, GA155. It reminds me of the New Age manifestation exercises of creating an ideal and feeding into it. Is there a connection? Well, Wolf must be psychically working today, because this question goes great with the first question. So Iris is talking about a Rudolf Steiner lecture, and the lecture number is GA155, and it is about the Luciferic impulse. So in anthroposophy, the Luciferic impulse is sort of one, is a element of human evil. It's not that simple as to say good or bad, but Lucifer represents kind of an element or polarity of evil. Not pure evil, but a confusion, really. And confusion through drawing humanity to upward another body through spiritual teachings or what have you. And so that the energy with Lucifer is being drawn out of your body. Disassociation is sort of how Lucifer likes to operate. He likes to feed on humanity through disassociating them from the body often. And so the last part of the question is, it reminds me, the Luciferic influence over our ideals reminds me of the New Age manifestation exercises of creating an ideal and feeding into it. Is there a connection? I think that there is. I think that, there's a great spiritual risk in just using the spiritual world and spiritual teaching and spiritual laws to serve your lower centers. So in the beginning of our spiritual development, usually that's how we come into spirituality, is we're coming in from a place of suffering, and we want relief from that suffering. And usually spirit is the last place where we turn. because our world is falling apart. That's usually how people will come into spirituality. So, in this way, you learn about spiritual laws as to how to get something, how to get a relationship, how to get money, how to manifest a material object. And, you know, in our culture, this is not seen as anything wicked. It's not seen as anything bad. It's actually seen as spiritual. But from the spiritual perspective, the genuine spiritual perspective, the real power that comes into a soul comes from actually renouncing the spiritual world and actually releasing attachments. So it's like real spiritual power, real spiritual abilities are gained through actually renouncing the material world and saying, okay, God, okay, Christ, let me serve you. Show me how to serve you. That's going to be my priority. Show humanity. How can I serve humanity? It doesn't matter what I personally, you know, want in the material sense. It's how can I be a vehicle for something greater than myself in service to humanity. And that is the real oath. That's what the real desire has to be, to connect with genuine higher forces. But in modern spirituality, it's like, it can kind of very much resemble black magic, which is what I think you're getting at here, Iris, which is like, how can we use, you know, elemental beings or spiritual beings in order to manifest a car, a house, a relationship, in order to have something in this material world. And the reality is the material world is fleeting. You know, our lives in on earth are very short, and most of our soul existence is in the heavenly planes. So it's sort of like this weird hypnosis that comes over us where we become too attached to the material plane and focus too much on our position here and what we can have, which is toxic to us, actually. So when it comes to, certainly, I'm sure some New Age manifestation teachings, if they're just centered around like, how can I, you know, just get something in the material world, and all the spiritual knowledge is basically how you can serve yourself, then either, whether that be conscious or unconscious, then that is a Luciferic act. That's absolutely a dark, it's actually a dark place to live from, because it's going directly against how you have to operate in order to genuinely connect with spirit, which is releasing attachment. If you're looking for, if you're saying to yourself, to feel powerful, I have to manifest what I want. To feel, to heal, I have to manifest this physical thing or have this, then that's a delusion. You already are perfect. You already are a divine soul. You don't have to manifest anything in this physical world to give you value. Okay. That is innate within you. The Spirit of Christ rests within your heart no matter who you are. And that is what we create our life with and from. And it demands nothing of like the material in that, you know, selfish sense to do that. That's trying to use the material world to fill a void. And the sooner that we can understand that, the happier we become, because we stop focusing so much money on so much time on money and trying to build this material empire when it's just made of sand, because the shrouds of heaven have no pockets. We take nothing with us. What becomes our wealth in heaven are our good deeds. Very simple, almost cliche. It's how we loved people, how we were able to love ourselves, where we were kind. That translates to genuine wealth and spiritual power and initiation in the spiritual planes and in your life. But to do that, that naturally means a renunciation of the material forms and addiction to the material world and lower center stuff. And you can find so many spiritual teachings and spiritual teachers allegedly, that will tell you it's okay to do these things because the demonic plane depends on you being absolutely addicted to power, to ego, to money, and to status. And they will tell you whatever they have to do, demonic entities, in order to get you to keep serving that system that is ultimately inherently beneath you anyway. Okay, this next one is from Petrus. Hello, Petrus or Petrus. Okay. A while back, you mentioned the concept of parthenogenesis as an earlier form of human incarnation, before our more familiar reproductive organs later developed. Is that idea directly from Steiner or your own clairvoyance? Okay, so the idea that humanity and human life was created through essentially parthenogenesis is a tenet in spiritual science that existed before anthroposophy even came to be, even before theosophy came to be, before the Eastern teachings came to be. So there's an objective reality to how humanity came to be on the planet and how humanity evolves on the planet. This happens through something that's called the law of recapitulations or recapitulations, which is you have one system of life that's introduced, and then over time it becomes more complex and builds upon itself. So you have basically living archetypes that are within the human being and the earth that we live through in recapitulations, always adding something new. And so in the earlier periods of development in both theosophy and anthroposophy, we look at these earlier periods as being called the Polarian epoch, the Hyperborean epoch, and then halfway into the Lemurian epoch. These are the more feminine sort of energy periods of human development, and they're characterized by reproduction, which is like a form of parthenogenesis. For those of you who don't know, parthenogenesis is immaculate conception. It's what we would see today in esoteric Christianity as immaculate conception. And the principle of immaculate conception is just an evolved form of how reproduction happened very early in human development. So in the Polarian epoch, the Hyperborean epoch, and the Lemurian epoch, we see that reproduction happened from basically a mother cell, and then a daughter cell would emerge from it through basically budding or splitting or mitosis. And so this is, of course, when humanity wasn't even solid yet, but you can't discount it because eventually it is that form and that process that leads to humanity. So you can't just say, oh, well, humanity looked like a beanbag and was made out of an astral glob. So I'm not going to use that because we now have organs and skin and bone and nervous system and all of that. Now we have to include the entire trajectory because we have to understand the beginning, because everything from that point is a recapitulation of those basic patterns. So we just can't discount ourselves when we have a form that doesn't look like it does today. So in the earlier periods, they're characteristically more matriarchal. And then as time goes forward, it becomes more patriarchal. And the mind develops and the character begins to change to a more solar, increasingly solar nature. And the sun also increases in intensity as well to ring that in. So essentially, the parthenogenesis aspect that was budding, or like in theosophy, sometimes it's called sweat-born, which is a process of mitosis. Eventually, that is carried on for a very brief period in Lemuria, even into Atlantis, and even with some women later into the post-Atlantean epoch within certain sects in which it was preserved and in which those women were prepared, which is where you get the idea of immaculate conception. And this is a whole teaching that's within what I call the Venus mysteries that we don't have time for today, but it is essentially, that's a recapitulation within the human being of very early humanity, which was like when you read, which is present in both the Eastern mysteries, theosophy and anthroposophy, which is basically like you have an early form of human beings, like, billions of years ago in, say, the Hyperborean epoch. There's a point there where you have the human form, which is really a feminine form. Okay. And then you have basically a lightning bolt. And I think Rudolf Steiner describes it as a tentacle. But there's like a lightning bolt, which is a phallic symbol that comes and fertilizes basically this feminine mass that is developing on the planet. And it's not the planet necessarily, but the human bodies that are not yet fully formed. They're sort of like an etheric, like blob. I know it's so strange. So then eventually by the Hyperborean epoch, you do have the introduction of the father or the male that's coming in and beginning to introduce the lightning male impulse, which eventually becomes male and female reproduction. Eventually organs form that reflect this, in which we have the phallus and the yoni, and it goes forward from there. But the idea of reproduction does begin as parthenogenesis, and it is carried forward in certain mystery sects that are feminine, that were within the Christ stream. And this is within the Venus mysteries, the Marian information, and things like that, has been greatly kept secret, greatly, I think, kept quiet for good reason. But no, that idea does not strictly come from Steiner. Steiner was teaching something that was very much just a foundation in mystery school science, which is the formation of humanity, the formation of the earth going back billions of years. It's there for people who want to take a look at it. Because Blavatsky did it before, and before Blavatsky, obviously the Eastern mysteries spoke of it, and before the Eastern mysteries even came to be, it was a reality in Atlantis. So when it comes to spiritual science or mystery science, it's not really like the development of humanity, the earth. These are staples. This is the academic level of mystical study that has been taught for thousands and thousands of years, essentially. We used to just know it. It used to just be part of our being, right? But then as the earth and humanity became denser and denser and denser, we forgot. And then the mystery schools began to keep the information. And then you get what we call occult science. Okay. Oksana, I'm wondering on your thoughts on supplements. Do you take any? I know true healing comes from Christ within, so is it a waste? Yeah, so I actually do take some supplements. I'm not somebody who thinks that we have to put the kind of pressure on ourselves where, because all healing does come from the essence of Christ within us, that we have to only solely depend on that. And if you don't just heal yourself miraculously through, the God essence within you, that you're like a failure as a human being or something like that. I know that there's a lot of Puritanism that can go on. And the reality is that all healing does come through essentially Christ within us. But we are still responsible for the care of our physical bodies, meaning that we have to eat well, which can include taking supplements if you're low on things. I mean, the food supply is not in the best condition. The soil is not in the best condition. The air is not in the best condition. We know that. So I don't think there's any harm in finding good supplements that support your body. This is just my opinion as a human being, not a doctor. And so I think that you have to do everything to take care of your vessel, breathe properly, get a good sleep, exercise, and you have to take responsibility for it. Very, very, very few people on the planet can just subsist on the essence of Christ within their being. It is possible that certain masters can do that, but we have to listen very closely to our bodies and learn to listen to our body. And we have to learn to listen to how certain foods affect our body, certain environments, certain people. And we have to learn when our body feels good and why, and when it starts to feel bad and why, and take responsibility for keeping it that way. And that's part of how we actually spiritually develop, is being able to read those things. Okay, this question is from a member, so the name won't be said. And this says, is there legitimacy to the claim that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married? It strikes me as being a fixation on a pre-Christian paradigm when physical bloodlines mattered for initiation, but Christ transformed that. So does it hold any truth? Thank you. I agree with you here, and I've spoken about this a few different times in member sessions. I've made some posts about it, but one of the propaganda narratives that seems to make it heavily into Hollywood popular books is that Jesus was married, and he was married to Mary Magdalene, and they had all these children after his crucifixion. And basically, the result of that is that Jesus is just a normal man who had children, and there is therefore also this exalted bloodline that exists that has the blood of Christ flowing within them. These are special people. And this is absolutely this story is exactly what you're saying it is, which is the reality that our minds will often construct a false narrative that reflects the old way of being. So if we don't understand the initiation of the time, right, which is the real story of Christ and Christ's life, then what we end up doing is placing Christ or placing any figure in this kind of environment of prior epochs. Now, the Atlantean epoch was an epoch that was very centered on blood. It was extremely tribal. A lot of the stuff about racism and prejudice and superiority and just racialism stems from Atlantis, when, Christ had not yet incarnated and shifted the etheric body of the planet through a sacrifice. So when you get back into Atlantis, you're looking at an extremely tribal culture that relied on something that's called blood memory in order to connect with the spiritual world. So in the Atlantean epoch, and even moving into the post-Atlantean epoch for many people, there was an absolute obsession with race, breeding, and blood. Because if you mixed your blood in the wrong way, then that would mean that you would lose your connection to spirit, because every group sort of had a certain planetary sequence or energy that it was expressing in Atlantis. So it wasn't like one was better than the other, but it was just different, right? They were expressing a different aspect of God. So it became very much about, preserving the bloodline. And this is very key, even with some people who are like in the esoteric field, who obsess over like race and obsess over blood and even blood magic. And they're just trapped in this extremely antiquated system. And they're unable to get into the next phase. They're just locked in it. And so ultimately, your physicality, your blood becomes the most important thing. It's not. It's just not. It's not the most important thing for the planet and for human initiation at all. Every single person has the impulse of Christ within their being and can transform from wherever they are. It's not even really correct to compare, to be honest with you, because that's not the point, right? So ultimately, when we take Jesus and we start applying him to that, you get the Mary Magdalene story and the idea that there has to be the special bloodline, when in reality, the whole point of Christ's blood entering the earth was so that the essence of the Christ being, which Jesus had taken on and was occupying Jesus' body, that made it so there was no need for sacrifices anymore. There's no need for a lot of the dark aspects of paganism anymore. They would slowly be rendered ineffectual, and that the blood and this tribalism is no longer this important thing that people need to be obsessed about. We experienced a liberation from that, and now everybody's blood contains the Christ impulse within it. And now everybody has the ability to liberate themselves from the material plane because that essence is now within them, which was not before Christ entered into Jesus. So that is the core tenet in esoteric Christianity, and especially in anthroposophy. So that's where that knowledge comes from. So in my opinion, that is, again, trying to take Jesus and turn him into like a regular person, which ultimately just invalidates your own relationship with yourself, because it's not allowing you to understand the alchemy that is occurring within your own being, right? So there are certain periods in planetary development where masters will essentially perform a rite on behalf of humanity. And that it's very important that we understand what that rite is to move forward. And so Jesus and the crucifixion being one of them. So you're absolutely right. It strikes me as being a fixation, the idea of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, it strikes me as being a fixation on a pre-Christian paradigm when physical bloodlines mattered for initiation. But Christ transformed that. Exactly. I think you said it so well there, is that there's always a period where the paradigms, beliefs, ideologies from the sort of dying epoch bleed into the current epoch, and they really try to hijack it. And because there's a great fear within human beings and within astral entities of making the transformation it requires to move into the next age. There's a very deep fear of death, of transformation, of change on a primal level. And so when somebody has a lot of fear, they'll try to keep that old recapitulation going and absorb everything into it to validate their dying way of being, which is exactly what happens when you start talking about, Jesus had all these children, like they say in Hollywood all the time. Obviously, Hollywood is Babylon Inc., right? And then you also see, like the Da Vinci Code and all these, even as I've even seen people who claim to be spiritual teachers and master esotericists say this about Jesus, when in reality, to do the right that Christ did, that Jesus did, you would not be in a relationship normally. The relationship of love and connection would be with the world. It would not be with another person. That would have occurred in the Atlantean era, and for some, even the Lemurian. But Jesus would not be in a relationship like that. He would have been in that kind of relationship with humanity at large in order for him to do the right that he did. So that's my opinion on that. Okay, this is another member question. Okay, signs of the end times suggest it's happening now, but the end of the epoch isn't projected until the year 3573. How do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory timelines, especially considering that some of the signs appear to be man-made? So this is a really good question, because it's true that we really actually have a few thousand years technically before the real end times happens, in the sense of like you actually see the planet no longer existing in the material space. So in spiritual science, we recognize that the planet begins as an astral form and that humanity begins as an astral form. And then we go through the fall or materialization, right? And then once you kind of reach a peak level of materialization and development, you get the Christ impulse. And that leads to the spiritualization of humanity back into an astral form, but completely transformed as individuals. So when we fall into matter, we're like children. And then by the time we rise out of it, we're significantly much more advanced. We're more like, intermediates or so. And so in the anthroposophical system and theosophical system and Eastern mysteries, the end of technically like the end of our earthly epoch, the planet isn't even physical anymore. And so by the time you get to our period, what we're really looking at is sort of the dematerialization of humanity and the planet, and the sort of we begin to see the entanglements that we have, therefore, with matter. And there's obviously, you obviously get things like the rapture. You get things like humanity being challenged in a few thousand years or so with ascending with the planet or not, which is very popular in the New Age, but actually exists as a principle in spiritual science, which is the deeper meaning of the rapture and the sun and the connection with the sun. And so I would say that when we enter this phase where we're supposed to be kind of purifying ourselves of our connections to matter as we're becoming disentangled, which we're supposed to be kind of transubstantiating the material world, essentially, we have to confront the evil within us. And so even though we're not technically at the end times, meaning the sort of end of our epoch, we still experience it because we're still experiencing the early recapitulations of it. Because we have to remember that everything happens in recapitulations, in cycles. So what happens is you begin the end times around now, really, and then it goes through phases where it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. But there isn't just like an end times. You work your way into it via recapitulations over and over and over again. And so we're beginning that now because we're beginning to actually lose matter and gain spirit. We're becoming more etheric slowly. And so that process can be very painful because if you have any attachments to matter, then that goes against the natural rhythm of creation. So it's like spirit and the cosmos is asking us to release matter, and then the more we cling to it, the more painful it is, which brings about the sensation of end times, and it brings about a pressure on society to purify, and it brings about humanity seeing the evil in society and the evil within themselves. And so it brings about the experience of it, even though it's not technically the end of times, you still get the experience because there's always evolution of a certain order going on. And I think your point here about a lot of the signs being man-made is a great point. So what happens is that you get dark occult groups that you could also just see them as being possessed individuals by demonic entities, really. And they will try to bring about the end times in order to create a controlled demolition of the world to swing things in their favor. So you could say that there's almost like an earlier version that will be brought on because Black magicians will try to create the end times to swing it in their favor. And we can see that happening now. It's been going on for a while, is this idea of these created catastrophes, these created social problems that where certain movements are introduced that create a divide and conquer narrative. You know, the wounding is there in humanity, but certain environments are created in order to manipulate people into hatred. You're seeing just various different things that are going on today that are pretty much a group and people trying to create the end times in order or trying to create situations, manufacture them that make people think it's the end times to create the end times so they can control it. So it's a way that people manipulate others, is through the sense of survivalism. And because humanity has known for a long time about this period, they can take the symbols from holy books and try to create it beforehand. And therefore because they created it, they're the source of it. It's not a natural source, it's from man, right? Then they can harness the energy from that. It's a way of control. And it's been going on for a long time to a lesser degree, but it really amps up with the idea of end times, because in even end times, there is the essence of the beginning. And so while there's this dissolution of society and certain structures in society and all this change, there's also the ability to plant something new, to plant new seeds, right? And that's what I think darker forces are really after, is certain things. They really want to build a new society, right? So for the Antichrist system or the beast system or the demonic system, they really want to create a technological dystopia, essentially. That's their idea. The Christ forces want to create a more natural, harmonious way of living on the earth and living with humanity through spiritual means and harmony, and having spirit move through them in service, right? Whereas the darker forces want to have all humanity and everything, every plant, every animal, every mineral in service to them. And they just absorb it all. And so to do that, they want to create a technological dystopia, right? And they're going to do that through trying to introduce this weird stuff with UFOs and aliens and all that kind of stuff. And they have to recreate a new origin myth. They have to say they've discovered these documents that rewrite the Bible. There's certain things that they have to do that are destructive, right? Kind of part of this end times thing, but they're really there to try to plant the seeds of a dystopia that is dark, and it's really about control. And it will be a culmination of basically everything from the prior era that was not transformed. So it will be through the idea of Babylon, of Sumer, things like this, lunar. So with that destruction that comes with reaching the end of our planetary stage, you also get the seeds of something new being planted, which we can clearly see going on right now, with lots of different things we've already talked about on this channel. And so with every destruction, there is a reintroduction of the new age, in their opinion, and they want that to be a certain way. So that's what's going on. Okay, this is another member question. I feel a strong connection to Magdalene, largely because I was a fallen woman who's now striving for higher. How can I purify my mind, body, and heart from old sin, especially sexual sin? I feel like old experiences and memories are holding me back. Okay, so the Magdalene has a bunch of different sort of symbols within our consciousness. One symbol that is associated with the Magdalene, and not everybody agrees about, but I think holds value, is the idea of the holy whore. And, some people see the Magdalene and the Virgin Mary as this paradigm between the holy whore, or the whore, and the virgin. And this is actually very important in the feminine mysteries, because as we were talking about earlier, the woman is basically the essence of sex, and through her, life comes. And so there's a very special power that women had, especially in the early epochs, over spirituality and over humanity. It was only much later, later into the Atlantean epoch, that women lost this power. But in the later Lemurian epoch and Atlantean epoch, they were very dark actions that women were doing around their sexuality and around sex for control and magic, and it became very, very dark. And so this idea of the virgin and the mother versus sort of the whore, and having the feminine karma, the karma that exists within the female form, to do with sexual manipulation and to do with black magic through sexual rites, and to do with centering in the lower chakra. So when we get to the essence of the virgin, it's not so much about whether or not somebody has had sex or not. It's about whether or not that individual is operating from the heart center. And when you operate from the heart center, actually your entire system turns into a virginal system again in every way. So that is part of the feminine mysteries. And there's different mysteries and different archetypes for the male form and the male being, and the female form and the female being, because they've existed separately, obviously, for so long, and they have their own collective karma that each one of us takes on when we take a male or a female body. And it's very important that we work on that in our life. So the way through that and through healing that is through the connection to the heart center. The more loving you become, and the more you carry what would be considered the 7 virtues, the more you purify yourself. Everybody, every soul in existence has dark and light. So the first thing is that you can't, beat yourself up because you didn't know something at some point. Every wound that you have is waiting to be alchemized into wisdom. The other side of that wound is your gift, is your wisdom. So we can't look back at earlier points of our life or past lives or whatever and feel this incredible shame. I mean, we can't like ignore it or avoid it, but you can't be so hard on yourself to not see that that is going to be also part of your greatest gift once you're able to transform it. Now, the simplest way I could say that is to do it through the virtues, the 7 virtues, which were also many times portrayed as 7 women or the Pleiades. So it's through love and compassion and living that every day towards yourself and others that returns to you. And so it's basically through right living, through right thought, which applies to males and female. It's through that we are restored. But first we have to work through self-forgiveness. And to clarify the lower centers is to heal our trauma, because actually all trauma tends to, if it's been around for a long time, it tends to settle in the lower center. So the sacral center, the root chakra, that's usually where it tends to settle. And so very, very good to do, I would say any opening postures in yoga as well, like the yogic squat that opens the pelvis is very good. Anything that's dealing with breathing and opening in that area is going to be very good, and focusing attention there and really dealing with and feeling what arises. That can be very helpful. And it just takes time, but remember to have that softness, that love, that compassion, listening, and then to bring that Christ force into it, which is the alchemical solar force that transforms all things. That's sometimes left out of healing, is that there's an alchemical fire in the heart, which is the Christ force. That's what that is. It's actually Christ within you. But how we experience it is as a consciousness. So some people get really mad, like religious purists, when you say Christ consciousness. In reality, that's how we describe how the Christ being feels within us, because he's within everyone. It's not a literal man standing in you. It feels like a consciousness. So a lot of spiritual esoteric words are describing the feeling of the phenomenon. And then there's sometimes the more objective version of it, because in a way we are standing within the Christ, actually. So you have to bring that essence to yourself, and that's what creates the alchemical shift. It's not just the knowledge of our pain. We actually have to bring the essence of Christ to that knowledge, and that's what creates the alchemical process. That is the solar force. That's the Christ being, the Christ essence that actually creates the alchemy within our being, right? In prior epochs, pre-Christ, just the knowledge was enough. The gnosis was enough because we were just preparing to receive. But now we have to actually bring in the Christ essence into our body, into our mind, into our heart, and work with that in order to create that transformation. We have to acknowledge the being that is greater than ourselves. That's part of our path now moving forward. Okay. So it just takes time. It just takes time and right living, and that's basically, I would say, a simplified version of it. Okay. Son of a bear. Do you have any new insight on the bifurcation of society? What will the nature-based communities look like in the near future? So a long time ago, must be like 5 or 6 years ago now, maybe longer, I always saw that it was as though the world was going to split in two, like two different paths were going to emerge. And one path was basically a path of evolution, which was associated with the Christ impulse. And one path was of devolution, which is the Antichrist impulse, essentially. And this bifurcation would only become stronger and stronger and stronger as time passed on. Now, one quality that can be immediately recognized is that those in line with the Christ impulse began to return to nature and saw nature as a technology, and their joy and love became around learning how nature worked as a spiritual organism and how they play into that. And so it became more about cultivating like a food forest, or how to create homes and ways of living that are in harmony with nature. You think about Rudolf Steiner's biodynamic gardening, right? The architecture. It becomes about prioritizing the spiritual development of people within a town. It's just a completely different system than we even have now. And so that actually begins to emerge, which is really a more heavenly way of being, and is the way that human beings will live when we're in a much more exalted state. We begin to live that way. And we see also what in anthroposophy is called social threefolding. So we already have before us, and we have for a very long time, how this kind of society can function. It's always been there, kind of waiting in the wings, but humanity just has not yet, I think, been pushed enough, or there hasn't been enough contrast in order for humanity to desire to kind of live that quietly, or in that kind of harmony, although there are people who are completely ready for that and find a lot of joy in that. But when humanity is in so much hyper-stimulation and kind of the way we are now, that can be, I think, a hard sell. The way that we are supposed to live can be a hard sell when the temptation of distraction is so intense around us. Then on the other side, there is the other bifurcation, the one that centers around Antichrist, which is basically a completely synthetic way of living. So as we see more natural ways of life, you see also certain portions of humanity sinking deeper and deeper into basically a technological dystopia. Sometimes when I hear about like Donald Trump's idea of freedom cities, where it's like, what does that mean? You know, is this the beginning of that technological dystopia? Is to, destroy the financial system slowly, to destroy the idea of energy, gas and oil, and then to bring in this like basically technological dystopia that people think is going to liberate them, but is actually going to be more debilitating. And so that is the Antichrist system. That's what the mark of the beast symbolizes. It's really a false synthetic system that's really an extension of the eighth sphere that's beginning to form on the earth. And you know what? You could tell people that this is not a good path to go down all day long, and they'll still take it because there isn't the perception, there isn't the senses and perspective to see that it's not good. So this is the weird and crazy thing, is that some people will walk right into that feeling like it's a good thing to do because they just don't have the development to know otherwise. And that is how the bifurcations in when planets evolve, that's how it always works, is you get these two streams. This is part of cosmic evolution, is to have these two streams. And then you get something called the transmigration of souls, where at the end of a planetary sphere's development, you get a transmigration of souls where there's a separation, and different souls go to different planetary spheres depending on their level of development, and so on and so forth. So the nature-based communities, in my vision, look a lot like what I see coming through anthroposophy, which is why I've chosen it as the system that I use the most. Is you look at something like biodynamic gardening, okay? So many incredible farms and wineries are now using biodynamic gardening, which does not harm the soil. All right, it's using the placement of certain plants, it's using the lunar cycles, it's using the Earth's esoteric energies and themes to properly yield crops. It's not really using any of the external controls that we use. And so the natural system is basically learning how the earth operates, not only physically, but her esoteric aspects, how she works with the different planetary spheres. And you're using that in a deep harmony to live everything about your life. And that's where we begin to really cook with gas, because we start to learn more and more about ourselves, because human beings are simply part of that system. So the more harmonious we live with the earth, so actually surrendering to it, learning to speak to the earth, learning to speak to the elemental world, the animal world, the plant world, the more that we learn to live harmonious and in communion with them, the more advanced we become. The more that we think that we're going to re-engineer and redesign every tomato, and we're going to like grow the babies in laboratories, this is a sickness. Okay, you're not going to re-engineer a better apple or a better tomato, through GMOs than nature's going to create. You can't even fathom the level of consciousness that's going into the apple even existing in the first place, or the mushroom existing, or whatever it may be. So this idea is hubris. It's total human arrogance that we can create a better world through our own will. The power comes through surrendering that ego and uniting and harmonizing with God. That's where the power actually comes from. But we have that lesson to learn. So we will see these different communities going on for thousands of years. And then we'll also see the complete degeneration of humanity that decides to go down the Luciferic, Armonic, transhumanist, dystopian side. And I even see people, who claim to be, Christians, who claim to be spiritual, even, who will promote AI and will promote this transhumanist system, which is completely bizarre. And there should be no support of that. It's dangerous. Okay. All right. This next one is from a member. What forces are involved in a particular place having a magnetic pull for a person to travel there, move there, etc. I'm from the US and I've dreamt of being in the UK since I was young. Is it intuition about the future or due to a past life or what? This is a great question because there's actually different, depending on even your astrological chart, there are certain places in the world that are actually more harmonious for you personally to exist. And it's not necessarily where you've been born either. There's actually a science to this, and I don't know too much about it, but I know certain astrologers listening probably do. But there's obviously a certain kind of life and energy in mountain ranges. There's a certain kind of life and energy at a beach or at an ocean side or in deserts. They all have a different kind of initiatory force, right? A different way of being. And so people are going to be attracted to that for how they can harmonize in that area in a kind of alchemy that they can create in that area with themselves. So there's also past life impulses and past life poles that you can have, which can manifest as an incredible desire to return to a certain place, a place that is not of your birth, a country that's not of your birth. And this is from very strong past life poles and unfinished business or just incredible joy, right? The same thing can happen when you're traveling or you see a picture even or a movie filmed in a certain place and you're like, I've been here before. This is somewhere that I've been. So you can get that feeling as well from just traveling somewhere. You may not want to live there forever, but you know that you've been there before. So our soul can kind of light up or even shrink down in certain locations, depending on past lives, depending on even just the core energy of the planet that's emitting there being harmonious with you or not. There's also people. Sometimes it can also be certain people that draw you to certain areas as well. But it can also be intuition about the future. You could have a very strong intuition to move because your area may not be ideal for you in the future, right? That's very real as well. So it could be any of those things. And I think it's important before you make a move to go there and feel the area, make sure that, it is true, that it's a correct assessment on your part, because moving is obviously a very big deal. Okay. This next one is from Claire. I kept having dreams about Jesus during pivotal Christian celebrations. The last dream I had was on the day of the Annunciation. What do you think could be the meaning of Jesus dreams on the exact date of Catholic feasts? That's fascinating. So the Annunciation, for people who don't know, is the day in which Mother Mary was notified that she would be bearing the Christ child, so that she would be basically chosen to carry Jesus, and that Jesus would one day give himself over to the Christ, and that the rite of the crucifixion would be done. Okay, so one of the things that is really important in esoteric Christianity, but doesn't necessarily take place in the dogmatic variations, is that Christ's life was basically one big ceremony or one big ritual. So sometimes the criticism for believing in a physical Jesus is that, Horus existed in the past and Apollo and the Solar King is just an archetype. Well, there's a certain point in planetary development where that archetype personifies, and it is lived out in a man, in a being, in a person. There's also feminine versions of this too, but we're talking about Jesus here, so we'll stick with the Sun King. So there is a point in human and planetary development where the archetype will personify. You will actually have a man that carries out these acts. And so that's a difference between, I think, some forms of Gnosticism and esoterica, that can take it almost there by understanding all the solar archetypes and all the esoteric stuff, but then cannot bring themselves to see that at some point it does personify for a ritualistic purpose for humanity. Because when humanity goes into our essentially our rise, where we're beginning to dematerialize out of matter, that happens through initiation. So that happens through essentially working and receiving forces directly from beings that are above us in the spiritual hierarchy. So we have to acknowledge the science of initiation, which is acknowledging beings greater than ourself, right? Which is essentially all within the Christ. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So if Christ's life and Jesus's life is basically one big ritual, everything about his birth, the timing of his birth astrologically, right? His whole life becomes a ritual on behalf of humanity. That's his service that he does. And now Jesus was a very deep initiate and was doing this for his level of initiation where he was. So that goes back and again with initiation science and how human beings evolve in their soul through interacting with higher beings. That's essentially how we evolve. And those beings performing rites and sacrifices on behalf of humanity. That's really how we evolve. We have to understand what those are and why to move forward. So when we understand that Christ's life was one big ceremony, basically, he was at the level where his entire life from birth to death was one big ceremony. You can see how the average individual would find themselves naturally getting into the rhythm of his life because his life was nature itself, right? His life was deeply intertwined with even astrotheology. He was living that. So naturally, you're going to find yourself seeing him, and you're going to find yourself interacting with him as a personification of those events for humanity. And also, the more that you study it, the more that you understand it, the more you call it into your heart, the more obvious it becomes, and the more you see it, right? So you have to sort of take that step, obviously, to study it, and then call Christ into your heart through prayer. And the more that you do that, the more you start to see it, the more clear it becomes, so you do have to kind of take that step, for sure. But his whole life was a rite. It was a ritual that followed a natural harmony and natural and cosmic events. So when you sink into them, you'll see him there. And that's what the great initiator is. That's what he does. That's how it's supposed to be. We're never alone in that sense. So, yeah. All right, this one is from Carson. Can you explain the relationship between Abraham, the 12 tribes of Israel, and their potential connection to Atlantis and its dark magicians? The tribe of Dan merged with the Canaanites and adopted their rituals. Why did they fall for this? So the 12 tribes of Israel has to be probably one of the weirdest and most debated topics. I have found some of the most bizarre information and teachings on the 12 tribes, and just everybody thinks that they're the 12 tribes. It's such a strange teaching at this point, but it is true that there is a migration out of Atlantis and into various different parts of the world, right? We know this to be true. And they've kind of been described in different ways in different holy books, these different sort of tribes of people. And the 12 tribes do correspond with the zodiac, and there's deep symbolic reasons why the number is 12. But once we see the fall of Atlantis, because you were relating it to Atlantis, we see a shift in consciousness. And in the post-Atlantean epoch, it becomes, which is our epoch, it becomes more important than ever to develop our individuality and individuate. In the Atlantean epoch, we only saw the very beginnings of our individuation. And it wasn't necessarily like we didn't have to have that mastered in those earlier periods. We just had to have it be introduced as a spark. In the Eastern tradition, this spark is called manas. It's the beginning of mind, which when we have the beginning of mind, we get the beginning of I am. And it goes from there, of self-awareness, essentially. But in the post-Atlantean epoch, self-awareness develops to the point where we individuate fully from the crowd, hopefully. And we even begin to do that, especially through acknowledging our own evil and acknowledging the darkness inside us. So a key point of individuation in occult science is basically you individuate through acknowledging your own evil and transforming it. And that's what essentially gives you the consciousness to become an individual, is self-awareness or to know yourself. And then through that, you unify that identity with a being greater than yourself, which is Christ. And then you are able to resurrect and leave the material world behind through entering that station of initiation. So when you see the stories of like the 12 tribes, it's very typical of what you would see when you start to have a degradation of the old consciousness and a new one developing. So we see individuals who want to try to keep the mind, like the lowest level of mind, as their king. And things like obsession with blood, obsession with tribe, and that is going to be a dying system by definition, because it's not acknowledging the impulse of our age, right? So even though there are advanced groups that came out of Atlantis, those groups are still going to be subject to the challenge of the new epoch. And some do very well with it, and some absolutely fall prey to lower forces. And there may be a certain susceptibility within certain groups of the 12 tribes to do that, because every single group is kind of like an aspect also of the zodiac. So the tribe of Dan is really fascinating because it has a lot of association with the serpent, and there's lots of different people that have come up with different theories about the tribe of Dan and all of that. But what I can say is that whenever there's a division in groups, it's ultimately about, can you overcome the darkness within you? And that darkness is usually associated with kind of I would say, the failings of the last era, or transform the kind of way of being from the prior epoch. Can you transform that or not? And so I mean, it would be a long Q&A if we went into the tribe of Dan and the 12 tribes. But just their connection to Atlantis and dark magicians, it's that when you enter a new epoch, going from the Atlantean epoch into the post-Atlantean epoch, you're going to, it doesn't matter how exalted you are, you're going to be challenged to integrate the consciousness of the new era. That's what creates evolution. And there are some that do and some that don't. And that will eventually polarize into the Christ stream and the Antichrist stream. And this happens in every epoch and in every planetary sphere in its own way, depending on those conditions. So why did certain individuals fall for, really dark Babylonian magic and dark occult? It's not even just Babylonian, but just like really dark pagan styles of magic, is that they couldn't understand the new impulse for whatever reason in their soul. So That's a challenge that every soul is faced with. Okay. This is a member question. Can you explain how Jesus' incarnation as Christ was different from other masters who have ascended before him? Many stories are similar many stories are similar. Christ's stream is the way out. So what about those in other religions? Is the stream reserved for Christianity? Okay, so usually there is so basically there's different levels of spiritual initiation. And a lot of the times when we hear about a spiritual master is the same thing as a saint in Christianity or a Buddha in the Eastern traditions. It's just a different word for the same phenomenon. That's just a bit more tangible to understand. So like a spiritual master is not like just a weird New Age term. The New Age has absolutely gone crazy with this term and degraded it to the point that I don't even know what they're talking about half the time when it comes to like masters. It's bizarre. But the term still has meaning. It's the same thing as saying a saint. The saints have also been a little bit, the terms, the terms and how it's expressed here tends to be degraded. But the idea that you can have a human being that reaches a higher level of initiation and no longer needs to incarnate in earthly matter at all, or in a different way than other people, is reality. Like that is evolution. That is the point of initiation. Every single mystery school was around the structure of eventually not having to incarnate into matter anymore and transcending matter, whether it be the Eastern traditions of breath and yoga to prepare the body and mind to receive the I and get off the wheel of samsara, or whether it be the more direct Christian adeptship that directly deals with resurrection. This is all about initiation. And so it's completely bizarre to me that people will not acknowledge that spiritual masters exist, because you're basically looking at yourself as a dead thing, right? The whole point in incarnating on the earth is to transcend matter, to transubstantiate matter into a higher form, which is what we call a spiritual master or a Buddha, sometimes a bodhisattva at times, or a saint. Like this is actually the reason why we incarnate. So it's completely strange to me that that word and this concept has become so distorted and people don't believe it. What do you think you're doing here? Like that's crazy. We're here to transubstantiate darkness to light, to transubstantiate matter into etheric astral matter through higher principles and integrating higher principles through right living. That's why we're here. But when you get to that level of adeptship and mastership, there's actually different levels of even masters. And a really good example of this is the concept of the Elohim. So when you look at the concept of the 7 Elohim, you have sort of 3 of those that are technically on the same level, but then one of the Elohim is a solar Elohim, which is really the Christ being, or even the angelic being in which the Christ enters. You have this in the angelic hierarchy too. So you have the angels, and then you have the solar angels, right? So there's always, even within an initiation structure, there's always like a gateway solar initiate that is the gate for the higher solar impulse into the lower systems. So in anthroposophy, there's the idea of like the 12 bodhisattvas that center around the Christ. So Jesus is the master, right, that is bearing the Christ. So the other masters within the system, or the other bodhisattvas or Buddhas, there's actually a difference between bodhisattva, but they're often conflated, so I won't conflate them anymore. But I'm just trying to say some people will use that terminology. So they're all technically within the same order, but the solar initiate is the one that deals most directly with the Christ, if that makes sense. And there is a reality. I was going to do a full lecture on this, but we'll just get into this a little bit now because you asked, which is that there are, so a lot of understanding initiation when it comes to angels and masters and beings that are within the higher hierarchy has to do with planetary evolution, which is why I'm such a stickler for always going back to that, is because certain things are possible within humanity at certain points, right? There's kind of an initiation structure within the planet itself. So the souls, this is how I personally see it and how I personally remember it and view it, which is that in the pre-Christ era of the earth, so before the earth receives the Christ impulse through man, right, there is the possibility of a kind of transubstantiation and entering into the immortal body for some people, some souls that are on a certain level of development. Those souls individuated in an earlier planetary cycle. So when the transmigration happens, there are some souls on the planet that individuated a phase earlier. Okay, these tend to be like the adepts and whatnot on a soul level. Okay, there's some souls that are coming up and they individuate later on. Okay, it's not a competition. It's just how the earth flows and develops with all these different kinds of individuals interacting with one another. So if you individuated earlier, you received the Christ impulse at an earlier time, almost in a different sphere. So you already have that to a degree within you. And so there's a level of transubstantiation that you can do within your being, okay? Then there's another level of resurrection or transubstantiation that happens along with the planet. So individuals who, so eyes or soul essences that individuated at an earlier phase carry the potential to transubstantiate matter to a certain degree in their earthly life before Christ, but it has to be under certain circumstances, and there's a whole thing around that, and it's not the same thing as in a later period. So the building of the immortal body is not the same thing throughout the development of the earth, is what I'm trying to say, okay? It's a little bit more complex than I'm making it, but I'm doing this to lay out the gestalt of the thing. Then there is the ascension, or the kind of collective rising of human beings and the earth together as the earth becomes more of an astral body. There's a kind of what is called, the rapture, or the idea of the sun flashing. There's different aspects of this in occult science, but it's sort of like everybody has the opportunity to transcend with the earth through the external pressure. So basically, through Christ, we receive the internal Christ essence that leads to the transubstantiation of matter, if we so choose to use it. But there's also an external impulse that we receive from the planet as well as it rises. And so we sort of have within us the internal flame, right, which is the Christ, that's gifted to us through the sacrifice. And then we're also exposed to this external cosmic shifting that's going on. And so that is a different kind of transubstantiation when you have the internal flame within your being, and then you also have the external pressures. Now, before Christ, those would have been individuals that had done that in an earlier development, had received the Christ impulse in an earlier development. This is my personal understanding of it. And were able to then do it themselves without the aid of the external shifting. So that means that at that level, the initiate can basically be in a descension cycle or an extremely dark time and still transubstantiate matter because they already went through the process in a different development. So do you see how it's like different levels of actually resurrection rites, different levels of transubstantiation rites, depending on where the soul is and where the planet is. So initiation science is actually, when it comes to transubstantiation and building the immortal body, is a lot more complicated than just Christ, rising from the tomb. It depends on, when it happened pre-Christ, there was certain conditions and certain souls that had done certain things prior, basically. And then there's the collective version post-Christ, because people have the ability within them to receive that flame, but there's also the external pressure of the world and of the planet becoming more astral. So it's actually a different kind of science. It's really the heart of initiation science. But I hope that's clear. I'm going to stop there because I really need to go deeper into this in a lecture, but I hope that makes sense as to the difference between Jesus and Christ. So, Jesus and was bearing the Christ being, right? And went through the process of death. And it was a whole different situation than someone maybe in earlier periods. So that was a right within itself. So there's lots to be said about the building of the immortal body or the diamond body or the resurrection body that actually is different phases of development for the individual. The highest of which obviously was done by Jesus as the solar initiate. But there were other examples of transubstantiation that happen in different circumstances, getting different results that are a different kind, if that makes sense. That's the best way that I can describe it in 15 minutes or less, which is a very, be patient with me. It's a very complex topic that, it's hard to talk about. Okay. So the stream isn't reserved for Christianity. Like the doctrine of resurrection or the doctrine of transubstantiation is actually a key doctrine in every single, religion. It exists there, but it doesn't become the central doctrine until Christianity. The reason being was because with the sacrifice of Christ, you see the impulse of that enter into humanity. The kingdom of heaven is now within. So people now have this ability, this flame within them and within the planet. The planet itself goes from a black sun center to a white sun center. And the planet slowly starts to become a sun after Christ's death. Okay, there's another thing to, and it begins to dematerialize and turn into a sun. Okay. That's the other part of resurrection on a planetary level that's important, is that once that Christ's blood enters the earth, the earth begins to become a sun. All right. So that leads to the dematerialization of matter, the transubstantiation of matter even within the planet itself. To the materialist, this is a joke. They laugh at this, right? But this is the whole point of us even living, is to understand this, right? Which to the materialist mind, even materialist New Agers or whatever, it's like hard to understand, I think. So in esoteric Christianity, because you have the entrance of Christ within the heart center, because that gives all humanity the potential to do as he did and to live eternally and to develop the resurrection body, that's where you see it become a central doctrine. It's not necessarily a central doctrine in earlier traditions because it wasn't time yet, but it's present, it's there. You can look at, the Eastern traditions and they're still practicing it. They're still very aware of it. It just doesn't become a central doctrine because of the timing and incarnation of the solar initiate at the time that it was happening, at the time it did. Okay. So in other words, it wasn't that, I'll end this conversation here, is that it wasn't so much that Christ, that Jesus and Christ, built the immortal body. Christ had already done that, and Jesus had already built his immortal body and entered it many different times through different rites. As a soul, as a being, Jesus had already done that many different times. It was already within his cell memory, is what I'm trying to say. The whole thing about Jesus and why he's considered the solar initiate and the master is that he did it in a way in which he basically gave his body to the Christ being. The Christ being is the macrocosmic entity of our solar system, of the cosmos. So he gave his body to the Christ being, and the Christ being then used his form in order to perform a rite on behalf of humanity, so he could enter a human template, basically. So and then he goes about and does a transubstantiation and resurrection. That's different than simply being able to die consciously or to build an immortal body, or that's doing that, but then adding 10 things on top of it, is what I'm trying to say. So I hope that makes sense, and we will get more into this if you guys are interested. But my hope is that we can begin to understand that the building of the immortal body or the resurrection body has many different components. And what Jesus as a master was able to do was one thing. It was the peak of planetary development and in many ways mastership. But there's other ways of building the body immortal and entering into it and doing that on a mastership level that's not, having the macrocosmic being of the cosmos enter you while you're doing it. Does that make sense? So we're looking at different levels here of the transubstantiation of matter and the building of the immortal body. And when you do that, certain things can be done that affect the collective, if you will. And this is getting into astral dynamics, initiation, adeptship, mastership, all of that, and all those dynamics that are very intense to think about because we don't see them, right? It's like it's hard to get into, and really see and believe something that you can't physically see. It has to come in another way. That's the thing. Okay. This is from Ashley. Hi, Gigi. How do you feel about Barbara Marciniak's work? Okay. I have not seen anything from Barbara Marciniak for, I think, 15 years. I honestly cannot remember what she has said or what she has written. So I can't speak directly to Barbara Marciniak, but if it contains any undertones about aliens creating humanity, like in a petri dish, and, alien beings being basically angels, this is not something that I subscribe to. Okay, this is a member question. Hi, Gigi. The cleansing and decalcifying of the pineal gland that is so much talked about, is that a myth or is that real? All the potions and drugs that are supposed to do the cleansing, are they mere money-making or are they really helping? Are there potions and drugs that apparently clean the pineal gland? I had not noticed this, that there was like, oh, I suppose yes, I actually know what you're talking about. Like if you eat almonds, it can help support the body of clearing the calcification in your gland. I do think that if you have a clean diet, meaning not like necessarily like you have to be like some restrictive crazy diet, but just like, paying attention to what you're eating and what your body likes and doesn't like, and where your food comes from, that kind of thing. I do think that you're going to, you know, have better glands, all your glands. I think your endocrine system will be happier if you eat healthy, if you exercise, if you breathe right. I also think that, but I have to say, like, you can eat almonds or drink purple tea or have as many vitamins as you want, that are supposed to directly decalcify the pineal gland, but that's not going to give you psychic sight. That's not going to open the third eye chakra for you. The only thing that really opens and will ultimately decalcify the pineal gland is spiritual development. You can make it an easier system in your body. You can make it easier for your body to operate, for sure. But the only thing that's really going to open a psychic organ like the pineal gland or the pituitary gland or whatever is going to be through spiritual development. Because when you begin to work spiritually through prayer, through meditation, through living in a loving, compassionate way, all the things that we discuss here, you basically begin to pull in spiritual energies. So you basically begin to attune yourself to spiritual forces, higher astral forces. And it's those forces that actually awaken the pineal gland and decalcify it. Because one of the things that causes calcification, which is associated with mineralization or the formation of like salts in the body, is basically having a thought system that's materialistic. So the biggest problem with the calcification of the pineal gland is materialism. It's literally causing the calcification and the materialization of this delicate gland within you. It's the ossification of the body, and other parts of your body will begin to ossify as well if you become too entrenched in materialism. So that's a really big one. But the more you attune yourself to spiritual forces, the more the pineal gland is exposed to these very high spiritual energies and will actually decalcify itself, essentially. But again, like, we shouldn't avoid the body. We do want to nourish the body. We want to feed it well. We want to, take care of ourselves too, which makes it easier. But like, no, you're not just gonna like take a power washer to your pineal gland or something with certain vitamins, and then you're gonna see, this is the thing, is that if we're decalcifying our pineal glands because we want psychic sight, we want spiritual powers, that's gonna come through spiritual initiation. That's gonna come through essentially things like meditation, things like self-forgiveness, forgiveness of others, compassion, love. That's where the body heals in every possible way. It's how you live your life. And then you can do certain meditations and things like that that attune you properly. But yeah, if you want the spiritual abilities, you're going to have to live a spiritual life. That's basically it. Okay. Jade Valentine. Hello, Gigi. Your content is amazingly insightful. Well, thank you, Jade. I wanted to know what you thought about the recent 4D resonance that CERN was able to map out in their collider, which depicted the infinity figure 8 symbol. Are they summoning the 8th sphere? Well, I've talked about CERN a lot. I think that, sometimes I look at like the newsletters that CERN puts out and how CERN gets trending on social media. And I'm like, I feel like they're trolling us at this point. I feel like there maybe was a point where CERN was the super secret nuclear research place. But I think a lot, ever since they've been getting found out and people have been digging around and associating them with basically opening the abyss, I think that they're doing things that directly troll us now. Like that's how it feels to me. But even if they're doing like when they did the sacrifice in front of Shiva, it is kind of like an in plain sight way of very low key, very trickster way of saying, listen, this is what we're doing. Because I don't care, how scientific you think you are. If you're going to be messing around with this kind of research that they're doing, it's going to have spiritual implications, right? So there's a huge ceremonial element to CERN, just like there's a huge ceremonial element to NASA and a lot of scientific things that are thought of as being dry, materialist considerations. There absolutely is a ceremonial element. You can't escape it. So also, I really find it fascinating that CERN was having a artist competition, or they were supporting artists. I guess they were like, we're going into the arts or something for a brief moment. And they actually picked an artist named Susan Treister, who created a tarot deck at CERN. And I actually talked about this with Dark Journalist years ago on a Halloween show. We went over some of the cards and stuff like that. And so it's like CERN, like they repeatedly will involve themselves in the occult. Like nobody asked you to put a Shiva statue on your front lawn. Like nobody asked you to do that. It wasn't a requirement, right? Nobody asked you to hire a psychic to design a deck of tarot cards and sleep at CERN at night. So there's definitely, at the very top, it's absolutely a ceremonial device. But I do think that they're basically like trying to take some control back and power back by making jokes about it and doing things like that. Because at that point, what else can they do? I mean, they're so figured out. A lot of the sort of rituals, like say in Hollywood or the music industry, that are clearly occult. Like, sir, you do not need to be wearing that symbol or doing it on this day and doing it. You are performing a ritual, right? So I think that people are beginning to catch on to these different things, and I think that their response is like to do it more and more intensely, and almost like it's mock us, but then it's not very funny. And so I think that we're getting into a weird position with CERN and with Hollywood and with music where eyes are wide open, and that's not good when it comes to ceremonial magic of the dark variety. It kind of requires your ignorance, really. If you have some dark magic stuff going on, it really only works best when it's subversive. So it actually is, they may be powerful, they may have money, but it actually is spiritually a problem when people start to nitpick and talk about this kind of stuff, because it does represent them losing power because they do not have the subversion element nearly as much as they used to, which is a hit for them. It's a hit for them. So I think that I'm really glad that we're talking about the eighth sphere, because this is this concept that was so hidden in the occult that really started to come out in theosophy. And then Rudolf Steiner came out on a few occasions and got into it even more. And so the eight spheres associated with that subnatural world. And CERN is thought to portal into that subnatural world. And within the subnatural world is the world of death. It's also considered a mechanical world. It doesn't have a soul. The soul is what frees you from a mechanical nature. It makes you not a robot. The subnatural world, the underworld, is the world of robots, of automatons, of soulless entities, of soulless things, and also of things that have renounced their own soul. And their soul is in a process of dissolving. So when you see anything trying to get into that subnatural world through nuclear research, you're looking at an occult rite, period. And on the surface, it's like, oh, yes, we're experimenting with power or engines or science, but there's a ceremonial element to it. And that's something that we need to confront. So there's a reason why it's called the eighth sphere. And you can see it in some of the anthroposophical drawings as well. There's sort of a link between, I guess you could call it, the moon and the earth. And from the moon then to black sun, and then to Saturn, what we call Saturn development. And I would even take in now Mars to an element. So the figure 8 symbol is very symbolic, but 8, when it comes to the mysteries of planetary evolution, is basically an artificial number. So when it comes to planetary development and the development really of spheres, it's 7. It's always in 7s. And so the 8 is a symbol of, when it comes to planetary development, artificiality, which is why Rudolf Steiner calls the 8th sphere an artificial sphere. And so there's lots of symbology with that. And it doesn't surprise me for one moment that CERN is out there doing this kind of stuff, because they really do dance that line of like mocking us, but also revealing, the deeper principles of what they're doing, because they have to, in order for them to funnel any energy to themselves to do what they want to do. Okay, this next question is from Celine. Hello, Celine. And you said, I wanted to ask you if you know about the deities people used to worship in the past. Were they beings from other spheres, or were they angels? And would it be okay for people to still worship them, or is it regressive? Well, I think that the way into this question, without just judging whether something is regressive or not, is to describe how humanity operated when we were living in pagan cultures, or cultures that would be kind of associated with paganism now, which is the idea of sort of many deities. So in earlier periods, humanity had harmony with the natural world and the supernatural world. So the natural world is like the world of the earth. So you have, just plants, animals, things like that. But also the supernatural world is where you see all of the angels, the different kinds of angels, elemental beings. And humanity could actually see these beings. And so when they looked up into the stars and the planets, they didn't really see like a ball of gas burning. That's not how they perceived it. Overlaid over that was the consciousness of a great being, right? The planet that you see that's Jupiter was a great being. It was Zeus, right? Or Venus was Aphrodite. And that was actually a class of angels underneath her, right? And so we knew that we were surrounded by beings, and that even every plant, every rock was actually a being, and was also guarded and kept by yet even higher beings. And so we lived in a living cosmos that was full of beings. Now we don't see things that way at all. Now it's like you live in a simulation. You live in a machine, basically. You very rarely hear people speak about the spiritual hierarchies. The spiritual hierarchies have been replaced by the idea that you live in a machine, which they call a simulation. And perhaps the reality that we live inside of beings is assumed. But basically, we're only now referring to the mechanical nature of the lowest level of reality, which is the lower astral plane, the earth, and the subnatural world. So that has become a cosmology in itself, and people call it a simulation, but it's technically incorrect. Technically, we live inside great beings. We're surrounded by beings, and we're beings ourselves. We're like a cell in the great being that is the solar entity. It's a being. So we're coming into this peak materialism where everything is becoming like a machine and everything is being described like a machine. It's becoming inhuman. And this is a problem. It's a problem when you want to understand the reality of the spiritual world and the spiritual reality of yourself. It's a problem. You can't have these kind of definitions, this kind of software that's operating and expect to connect properly. Eventually, you're going to have to change. Eventually, it's going to have to be corrected. You're going to have a system of beings because you're a being, right? So this is where we get the idea of these different elemental forces that are personified into different gods and goddesses. These are deities that emerge to represent aspects of ourself, and we would project into them and we would interact with them. But they were often sort of a mix of elementals and our own consciousness. And we would also see angels and spiritual beings. Now, angels have always been associated with different spheres. So when you have like the idea of the Titans and you have the idea of the Greek and Roman gods, and they're all represented by planets, these are angels. And great initiates were individuals who could interface with these angels. And the angels were essentially overlapping them and working through them. And we all seek to do that, which is why we have to acknowledge, as I keep saying again and again, we have to acknowledge that there is being greater than ourselves, because that's the structure of our own initiation. Okay? So we've always been surrounded by the angelic hierarchies, the spiritual hierarchies. And we used to call them gods in the past. They're not aliens. They're angels. That's the correct esoteric term for them that's been used for thousands and thousands of years, or Dhyani Kohans. That is the structure. And it's an esoteric one that we enter through going within ourselves and then out. We don't reach these things from going perpetually outward, further and further into the material plane, to different planets, in spaceships and things like this. We commune with the spiritual kingdoms through going inward, and through going in, we can go out, which is also the process of death and rebirth, and why that ritual is central in all initiation practices, death and rebirth, because that's actually how the material plane is transcended. And that requires the assistance of angels, masters and spiritual beings, for us to achieve this. So there's always been these systems where we are uniting with them in different ways and acknowledging them in different ways. However, in the earlier periods in which we were more, I guess you could say, pagan, and there was polytheistic and many gods, that's a certain time of human development in which we were not individuated yet. And so we would kind of project and interact with nature and the world in a different way, and we saw it in a different way. And then by the time we move forward where we're fully individuated, we're fully individuals, we have the idea of a one God. And that's where you see the transition from many gods to one God. Is it's not so much about like Christianity or these different earlier mystery religions that were, you have to follow one God now and everything. It's not about that kind of weird force. That's human stuff. What it's really about is that consciousness changes, and the many had to be unified in the one, because we were individuating, and we had to know all of these different aspects in ourself. So before, we used to have to project outside of ourself into these different elements of nature, and that's how we would learn about ourselves. We lived in a kind of harmonious state, right? But then when we individuate and we now are individuals with an I, right? Then we don't operate that way. We literally do not operate that way anymore. All of that is now within us as processes. And so we actually don't even need to do, the highest initiates, in the earthly kingdom, they don't need to even do really, they do everything from inside of themselves. Everything can be done from within their own being, and it's done. So this is the difference between earlier periods and later periods. Is it's not so much about like what's true or not. It's that human development changes and our view of the heavens changes and how we operate changes. Now, it's up to people to interact with the world in which they see fit, right? However, I would suggest that we observe time correctly and understand that systems do devolve, and eventually Christianity as we know it will also start to devolve. I think we're seeing it already, right? So it's not about being a fragment, basically. It's about understanding that human consciousness evolves, and the way that we view the world and interact with it, the spiritual world also evolves. Of course it does. So I would say that that's the difference between sort of the more pagan systems and the systems around one. And there's actually around one God, and there's entire esoteric dissertations on why humanity goes from many gods to one God, and there's a whole thing about consciousness and that you can look into. But that's basically the undercurrent there. So the one God is associated with the point of individuation, right? And the many are associated when humanity is still tribal. We're not individuated as much. That's one of the fundamental differences. So you have to choose the system that's going to serve your consciousness and serve your evolution. Okay. This is a member question. Is the black cube a portion of the masculine impulse of form upon Mother Sophia substance that is shared with us and named Ahriman when forming divergent thought entities? Maybe it's also the astral component of the cross. Ooh, I think this has a lot of good statements in it. The black cube is often obviously the symbol of materialization and can be associated with too much materialization, which is why there's all of these associations of like Satanism, but especially Ahrimanic Satanism with the black cube. Like tech people will get really into like black cube because it's a specific thing in Ahrimanic Saturnian Satanism. And so that's obviously that when you get that hardcore, it will automatically seek to control Sophia. It'll automatically seek to control and imprison the feminine element for sure. And yeah, Ahriman can be Ahriman, for people who don't know, is sort of like an archon. He's a fallen archai. So in the spiritual hierarchies, there's like the archai, there's archangels, there's angels, and then there's humanity. And humanity is basically beneath angel. And when human beings can basically overcome the earth, then they'll reach the level of angel. That's how the spiritual hierarchies and humanity work, making humanity the 10th angel in the hierarchy of angels, which is associated with freedom and developing freedom. Okay? And so basically Ahriman is a fallen archai. So Lucifer is a fallen archangel. So there's a difference there between Ahriman and Lucifer as far as I understand it. And so yes, Ahriman would represent, his force will create and sort of magnetize to himself divergent thought forms that are not within God. So what Ahriman does is he generates influence upon humanity that draws them away from Christ through materialism. And so that will absolutely form, basically, as you've said here, divergent thoughts and things like that, which are like an invitation to, join him, I guess, in his like black cube world. So yeah. So I guess maybe it's like a fallen. The cross is obviously, we've been talking a lot about Christ today, and obviously the cross is the cross and the crucifixion, which is, obvious, but the cross is also the symbol of matter. So in astrology, you'll have like the symbol, a good example is the symbol of Venus, which is the cross, and then the globe above the cross. So that is a symbol of a planet that has transcended the cross. It has transcended matter. The cross is matter. The cross is earth. It's materiality. So when Christ is crucified on the cross, that's an esoteric ritual about, obviously, humanity transforming matter, right? Or being entombed in matter, crucified in matter, stuck in matter, right? There's deep psychological, spiritual meaning in being crucified, as being nailed to the cross. You're stuck in matter, you're stuck in your body, right? And so when the cross is folded up, it makes a cube in geometry. And the Earth, compared to Venus, is the cross with a globe below the cross, symbolizing that the Earth has not yet transcended matter. So the cross in astrology, sigil, symbology, is matter. So there's different ways to read that, but they're very rich in esoteric influence. Okay, looks like we're going to get into the eclipse now. I was wondering when we were going to get into the eclipse questions. And as I talk about this, I can see a storm brewing in the sky, and the wind is picking up here, so that's perfect. Okay, this question is from Curious Cat. Hi, Gigi. Are we being manipulated into fear and to expect horrible things for April 8th to harvest our energy for CERN and NASA rocket projects that day, or a waiting of the Antichrist? So sometimes, like, I have this sort of sense where I'm always looking to see the topics that sort of run away on social media and run away in the minds of people. And this April 8th eclipse has been a complete phenomenon. Like, I've seen people talking about this that I have never even really seen broach the topic. I think it's because there's so many weird elements to it. Like CERN allegedly saying that they're gonna, fire it up. It's a little weird. And then also you have NASA studying the eclipse and sending all. It's not unusual for NASA to fire rockets and observe the eclipse, actually. But I think anybody who looks at this as like, oh, NASA's just doing scientific research, needs to read up about NASA, because NASA is an occult organization. It's full of basically Freemasons. You can't even become an astronaut unless you're initiated into Freemasonry. And NASA itself was founded by Jack Parsons, who was basically a top student of Crowley. And so when it comes to it, I mean, it's always funny when I see people who like practice Crowleyan magic and think that they're rebellious, or like that they're living beside the world, when actually the Crowley form of magic, Thelema, and is one of the most institutionalized kind of magic that exists in our world. Actually, it's extremely mainstream. It's not rebellious at all. It literally has created many different programs. So nothing rebellious about it. So basically, NASA was created by a hardcore magician. Jack Parsons was doing so many occult rites that his neighbors were complaining in Pasadena. They were calling the police on him because he was doing so many occult rites in his house. And this is the person who founded NASA. And you look at the different symbols they use, which are all the symbols of gods. They're all occult symbols. The dates in which they fire these things up in the space are occult dates. I mean, you cannot get a more occult organization than CERN or NASA. It would be weird if they didn't try to do something around the eclipse, to be completely honest with you. I would get suspicious if you had an eclipse like this pass by and they didn't start doing weird stuff, to be honest. That's like where we are with it now. This is where we are. So it's good to see everybody waking up to it, though, because as I said, I think it gets harder for them to, it's a process. So the first part of the process is seeing that it's occurring. And just that basically gives energy back to you. The worst thing that can happen is for people to not really notice, right? But eventually we're going to have to begin to actually directly counter these things. And that begins with understanding the spiritual, understanding spiritual reality in a grounded scientific way, actually. So we're going to actually have to begin doing that and counteracting these things. So awareness is the first step, but we have to go much further if we want to actually not be influenced by these things. But it's a good step. It's a good step. So let's get a little bit into the eclipse here. And I'm sure I'll have a few more eclipse questions as we go forward. But the easiest way to analyze something like this is you always have to break it down to what is the celestial event? What is it doing? What does it mean? I don't care if CERN is starting up. I don't care if NASA is doing their weirdo stuff with their like a pep rocket and the Egyptian things. It doesn't matter. What does the eclipse signify? What does it mean? What happens energetically on the planet when there is an eclipse? Once we understand that reality, the spiritual science of the thing, then we can start factoring in weird old NASA and creepy old CERN and all that kind of stuff going on. But first we have to grasp and understand the core dynamic that's happening spiritually. So what is an eclipse, especially a solar eclipse? That can be seen esoterically as basically an open gate or an open door to the underworld. So when the sun's rays are being blocked by the moon, right? That is momentarily in certain places, especially in a certain way, blocking the solar rays and thus bringing forth the potential for beings to enter from the subnatural world or the lower kingdoms of life. Okay, so this is why eclipses get a bad name, because obviously if it's just an open gate, you can see why ceremonially people would want to do different things to bring certain things in through that gate. But I want to remind you as well, an open gate is an open gate. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything that comes through it or goes through it is going to be evil. The whole thing about the secret of the moon and the secret about how things come into the earth plane to begin with is that it's not whatever, dark entities or even light entities want. The only things that can come through the gate of, say, an eclipse period or any kind of portal opened at any time is going to be an exact mirror of what humanity is thinking and willing and feeling at that time. So it's an open gate, but that gate is really a mirrored gate in which you can have a million different things wanting to come through, sensing an opening, but what can come through can only be what is within us to the degree that it is within us. Does that make sense? So a gate isn't in that way an open gate. It's a mirrored gate in which the only thing that can come through a portal is if it is within us ourself, within humanity ourself. So that's how that operates. So obviously, I'll add one more thing, and we can go further into the eclipse if there's more questions about this, but you could just as easily, because I know that there's a lot of fear around this and negativity around this, and I completely understand that, because you better believe that like people will use this for darkness, and people feared eclipses in the past because they could actually see spiritual beings and spiritual entities more easily, and things that were kind of coming and going, and that frightened them, right? There's a story of, the wolf devouring the sun and the moon, the obsidian butterfly in the Aztec culture that would come out during the eclipse and devour people. So there's very real fears about the opening of these gates. But I also want to bring this a little bit more into balance, because I feel like we need to acknowledge that an open gate is an open gate is an open gate. So you'll also have forces on the earth that use the gate for banishing darkness as well. So there's also higher beings, angelic beings, and people that use eclipses to use that gate to banish entities from the planet. So if you're going to call something in, that's an open gate, but you can also banish through that gate as well. Or you can also force things out that are within the earth, or whatever, out too. So we shouldn't be viewing any kind of occult phenomenon or eclipse phenomenon or any kind of astrological phenomenon as its lowest, darkest potential, and sort of live in complete terror and feel powerless because the rockets and the CERN are going. We really need to understand it in a holistic way. And then when we understand it's a mirror, and that's how things can even come and go, then you realize, oh, I just need to be in prayer that day. Like you should be, at some point in your day, you're living a spiritual life, and you need to be positive, loving, and that is what will hit the mirror for you that day. So it's like there's a tendency, I think, because we can't see the spiritual world, to automatically take on the most negative, darkest sort of take, which really feeds into the thing. Like I said earlier, there is a massive egregore attached to this conversation that's living on people's fascination with this and people's fear around this. And we have to get this conversation and other conversations that are going to come to the point where we get to, what is the occult science of the thing? What is actually happening? What's the mechanics? I don't care what the elite are doing with their weird robes and the dark things. No. What is the event objectively? What's occurring? What forces are, what is happening? We start there, like what neutrally. And then we can factor in planetary alignments. We can factor in ceremony and ritual. But we have to view it objectively, because when we just keep talking about these things in complete fear, we have to evolve the topic into something actionable, something empowering. Otherwise, we're just getting funneled into pointless conversations in which it's like a form of entertainment. So we have to evolve these discussions about the occult into something meaningful, and begin to use them and turn them into something that empowers humanity. That's where we need to get moving forward. We're at a point where we're acknowledging that there are occult rituals and dark forces. Now we need to acknowledge it more neutrally and turn it into something empowering. That's where we are now with this. And my opinion on Antichrist stuff is that I'll put it this way, a lot of what people think is about outer space is really about, I think, rituals to do with Antichrist and elaborate sort of things around that. Just my opinion. Okay, this one is from Marie. I see the word red heifer. I think I know where we're going. After the CERN questions, we're really getting into it today, huh? Okay, so this question is from Marie. Any thoughts on the red heifer sacrifice in Israel? So I remember hearing about like a while ago that there were some people from Israel that were trying to breed like a perfect red heifer so that they could, ceremonially bring about the Messiah. And there's a whole bunch of just, I think, conversation that can be around that. And that's a whole can of worms we can get into at another time. But let's get into the idea of what the temple is, because I think that, the idea is that all of the wars in the Middle East is really a preparation to retake the Temple Mount and build what's called the Third Temple. And this is a very controversial issue. But the reality is that the temple, when it's referred to in spirituality, it's not a building. Okay, it's not a building that you go walk into or that you build with brick and mortar. That's not what's being referred to with the idea of the building of the temple in the third era or in our period. The building of the temple is the building of the resurrection body, or the body immortality, or the rainbow body, or the immortal body, or the many different words for the glorified astral etheric body that we are building every single day with our thoughts, feelings, and will. Okay, that's the temple, because the body is the temple of the soul. That's what that means. It's not a physical temple. This is materialism. Okay, this is the height of literalism and materialism, and interpreting an esoteric idea in the most like materialist, literal way that you can possibly imagine. So that is that's my opinion on that. The temple is also sometimes associated with New Jerusalem. This is also in anthroposophy. This is the idea of New Jupiter, or the building of the Jupiter body, because the planet Jupiter symbolizes the next planetary development of the Earth in the anthroposophical system, or the esoteric Christian system. So New Jerusalem, the mystery word for that is New Jupiter. Jupiter is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is Jupiter. That's the mystery esoteric word for it. So this is just, quite frankly, a bizarre and weird and concerning situation, because again, the temple is not a physical building. Even Solomon's temple was made in the image of a human body. It was a building, but it was made in the image of a human body. But it was never about the temple, the physical building. It was always about the body, and the building of the temple is the building of the resurrection body, of the spiritual body in which our eyes or our souls will dwell when we transubstantiate the material world. That's the temple. So that's what I have to say about that. I'm not in agreement with, the idea that of anything else. So, okay, this is from Rikita, or Ritika. Sorry. One question I had was, how can I not blame myself about my past experiences and what I went through? It feels like every step I take forward, my past seems to haunt me. Thank you for your videos. A diligent watcher for 5 years. Thank you so much, Ritika. So I know it's so hard. Do you ever go to bed and, you're just laying in bed And suddenly, like, every little bit of suffering that you feel like you've caused washes over you. Every time you said something the wrong way that was out of anger or cruelty, every time you feel like you weren't yourself, just like floods back to you, and you're like, oh my God. Oh my God. It's awful. And I think that it's good to be able to look back and say, wow, I was a real jerk, and feel into the situation and feel where it was coming from. Like, why did I behave that way? What part of me was injured for me to behave that way to this person or to myself or to whatever? So the point of our consciousness returning to the past is to understand it and to give it a spiritual meaning in our life, to ultimately transform it, which is the theme of this talk today. So when you start getting into shaming yourself and blaming yourself, it's an unnecessary pressure. The pressure that needs to be applied is a loving feeling and analysis of what caused you to do it, and a deep examination of yourself. That's the pressure that's needed in those moments, not the pressure of shame, not the pressure of blame, which only really makes things worse. What's really needed is for just a careful examination from a place of understanding that just the reality that you feel bad means that you're willing to improve. And the more that you heal the part of you that you discover in your going inward around the memory, the more that memory will go away and actually transform into something else, a different version of the event within you. So we actually can release it by healing the part of ourselves that created it. But as long as that unhealed part of ourself is still reigning in our consciousness, it will continue. So it's just a sign that you need to heal that part of you still. But we have to avoid the blame and the shame, because that's not actually a pressure or process that's going to heal it. Right? It's just sort of dwelling and punishing yourself, when really it just needs to be the analysis and going inward and the healing energy towards it. Okay, this is a member question. What is the difference between channeling and possession? I know they are different, but wonder if they are somehow connected. If you open the door to channeling, are you also opening up to possible possession? Is there a good possession? Possession is typically used to describe when a demonic entity or negative entity begins to take over your personality. And it begins to take over your personality to the point where the individual's I, or the soul of the individual, the I is another word for the soul, basically, the individual soul. That element almost just recedes. And in the process of possession, the darker entity tries to take over the form and subdue the soul, and maybe even remove the soul from the body, or keep it at such a small, minuscule level of power in the body by taking it over. And there's a process of possession that happens through something called obsession. And there's different degrees that have to happen over someone's life for them to actually become possessed. This is a real thing, okay? We are surrounded by spiritual beings of every order of life. And it is through the attunement of our own heart in which we draw the spiritual world to us. It's through the clarity of our own mind that we see the spiritual world properly for what it is. And people will say, oh, I don't want to connect with a spiritual being, it's just dangerous. It's actually more dangerous to not be educated in spirituality. It's more dangerous to not understand the spiritual forces that surround you and how they can connect with you. Ignorance is the worst thing you can have, because when there is a dark entity, that's again part of our cosmology. And on Earth, we are surrounded by darkness and light, right? When a dark entity begins to surround you, the first thing it does is it tries to basically make you feel bad about yourself. It makes you think violent thoughts or degenerate thoughts that you wouldn't normally think, right? Impulsive thoughts, intrusive thoughts. And the more that you believe that that's really you, those are really your thoughts, these are really your feelings, this depression, this anxiety, the negative entities attach to our wounds and try to make them greater and greater within us, to make us deteriorate our willpower. So if you don't actually know that a spiritual being can do that to you, a dark entity can do that to you, then you're going to think that that intrusive thought is yourself, that it's coming from you. You're going to take it on right away. You're going to think that that period of depression or suicidal nature or whatever it is just you. You won't realize you have a really bad attachment. So education on spirituality is incredibly important. You're not safe by just trying to be ignorant. You're safer when you understand what is going on. You not noticing it or just sticking your head in the sand is not going to protect you from influences. The only thing that protects you is your ability to perceive it and the developing of your senses so that you can do that. Okay, so that's the first thing. And so this means that everybody is a channel, actually. I mean, there's really no difference between a great artist that's painting the scene that moves you and somebody who is taking a similar interface and turning it into channeling of a master or a demon. The process is that they're uniting with a spiritual force. And spiritual forces seek to find an expression in the material world. So the only way that you can get away from not connecting with basically demonic entities, and we talked about this earlier, where people channel demonic entities all the time. And they think that they're like talking to Jesus, or they're talking to Buddha, or they're talking to Krishna, or they're talking to like some whatever. And it's a demon that is pretending to be that, right? This is the issue with spiritual development of a psychic nature, is that it's like you have to almost go through these experiences to learn to not have them anymore. So there is a learning curve, and people shouldn't be shamed for going through this, right? Because that's how you learn the difference, is you have to experience negativity to know what it is and how it operates and to sense it. You also have to experience the great love of angels and spiritual masters to say, okay, this is that. So it is part of our development, and we shouldn't fear it in that way once we understand that it's our mind and our emotions and our will that really control those experiences. And the more that we purify those and attune those to love, to higher forces, to Christ, the safer we are. So it's not really like good possession, but it's not like good possession or bad possession, because it's a higher being, like your guardian angel, for example, or a spiritual master. They're not looking to like possess your body and take over your body. They already have a body. They're operating from a glorified body within their own domain. They have no need to take your body. They have no need to like operate on the earth except to serve you. Because in the higher systems of life and initiation in the angelic realms, serving people becomes the way to evolve. It becomes the way you reach further levels of initiation, is through service and sacrifice. So, you know, angels, masters, higher adepts in the higher kingdoms of life, like they're not looking to like occupy your body and like live through you. They want you to develop your individuality, your soul, and meet them. They want you to rise to their position. That's what allows them to go further in their development. So they actually don't want to possess you at all. They want to assist you in your process of self-realization and alignment with the higher kingdoms of life in which we have all fallen from, to develop our individuality. So they're helping with the glorification of our soul, of our I, which has nothing to do with like trying to kick it out of the body and control it. Now, demonic entities and people from the lower astral world, or beings from the lower astral world, they seek a form to live in and to operate in because they don't have one, because they've been cast into the abyss and are slowly, unless they can turn towards the truth, are slowly being dissolved of their essence. So they want to feed on essences and they want to occupy a form. So no, higher beings do not possess a body. They are trying to actually liberate your soul from your body, helping you. They're trying to help you transcend matter, actually. They're trying to help you graduate from the earth, right? That's what that's the whole point. Whereas demonic entities want to live forever in the material plane. That's where you get transhumanism, and like human beings are going to like live forever in this weird transhumanism body that's genetically modified to all get out, is because demonic entities and harmonic entities, they need a body. Higher entities are trying to help you evolve with the earth out of materiality. Demonic entities can't operate in that higher space. They can't operate in the heavenly realms. So they want you to forever live in the material world. So when you hear these bizarre ideologies, like you're going to live forever in your physical body, yeah, with a demon in there, this is crazy. Or you're going to go and colonize all these planets in your physical body, and there's no discussion about building your spiritual body at all. This is satanic stuff by definition. You don't live forever in the material plane. We didn't begin in the material plane, and we don't live forever in the material plane. We began in the astral plane, we descended in the material plane, and we build an immortal body, or the resurrection body, or the glorified etheric body, and we eventually transition our soul into that and live in the heavenly world. We become an angel. So all this stuff about existing forever in the physical world is demonic, because that's what the demonic world needs, forms. So don't fall for it. It's a lie. It's a lie. All right, this one is from Jen. Hi, Gigi. Thank you for sharing your incredible insight and your knowledge. Thank you, Jen. Your work has brought me so much comfort during these tumultuous times we find ourselves in. Thank you. Do you have any plans to continue your In Plain Sight series? Yeah. My In Plain Sight series started with 2 seasons of basically just outlining what public occult ritual is and the dark occult. And this last season and a half is Mars Mysteries. Because when I would look into the esoteric world, there was so much stuff about Mars on an occult level that was going on that just was not public. And so for me, it all kind of culminated in the idea of Mars and Ahriman and transhumanism, and exactly what I was talking about, like living forever in the physical body, a lot about atomic magic, like CERN and things like this, the fallen Mars impulse. And that's sort of where I analyzed a few performances and things like that for fun. But I don't know, for me, I don't know if the Mars piece hasn't really, I don't know if people get it. And I don't know if people are going to get it for a long while. But that's where I've left Mars Mysteries. that's where I've left it in plain sight. Is it's kind of like if it's not really getting picked up in a certain way, then there's not much I can do on it until there's more focus. It's sort of like you bring things forward, you discuss it, but if it doesn't get to a certain point, there's nothing else I can do on that topic until it gets to another level of work within the public. So that part of it is completed. I mean, there's more that I could go into it. I have a lot more episodes written, but I came to the conclusion that I can get into the Venus mysteries, which is really Isis rising, and we're going to do that for a while. So it's the resurgence of Isis rising, which I had to retitle the Venus mysteries because the videos thought I was like, sometimes YouTube would think I was talking about like ISIS as in the Middle Eastern terrorist group. So I'm renaming it Venus mysteries, but I'm going to go into a different avenue for the next few months. But I do love the occult analysis, but I actually feel like people are getting really good at the in plain sight analysis. I see so many like great blog posts and posts of people that are really, really exposing things and very astute occult analysis. It's so good. And it's like, it's already being done. Like people are getting so good at pointing at understanding the symbols and the ritual dates and the colors, ritual colors and the deities. It's just, it's a world of difference from when I did it in 2016. Like people are really good at it now compared to, it was really edgy, 10 years ago. I love doing it. I'd love to break it down a bit more. It's just time, really. Like I have to figure out what is the best use of time. But maybe we could do like add in some in plain sight and out. We did it a little bit today with CERN and the eclipse and things like that. I definitely try to always have some level of occult analysis and current events. But I think now, as I was saying, we have to go beyond just acknowledging that there is subversive occult activities, and we have to actually go now into acknowledging the workings of the cosmos, the science of that, and how to basically create the world we want now. So I feel like we actually have to get into a creative level with this, which I think that humanity will begin moving more into in the next 10 years. So it's almost like in plain sight has to be turned into, how to create now, I would say. But I do love doing the analysis. And man, if I had like 10 arms and 3 heads, I would do so many in plain sight episodes. I had so much stuff written. I wanted to get into like Puharich and Uri Geller a little bit more and the bizarre spectra, 3000 rhombus. I wanted to get into a lot of it, but a lot of it had I had talked about already. But yeah, maybe we'll get into it a little bit more in the future. But I'm really excited about talking about the Venus mysteries in the future. Okay. Stephen Wood, what to do if you are possessed by an entity for 4 years? Wow. Well, I would say there, purification. If you think that you have an attachment, now most people will have interactions with negative entities every day because we live in a world in which we are surrounded by angels and darker entities. And so the first thing that you have to do is you have to begin to purify yourself. So you have to begin to purify your mind of negative thinking, of like really observe your thoughts, right? And you do not want to engage with the dark thoughts because one of the things about entity attachment, as I said, is you get these, dark thoughts. You also have to begin to reset your system emotionally. So you can't allow yourself to dwell in the foggy and dark states of emotional lows. You have to like get outside. You have to make sure you're doing things that you enjoy. You have to recharge yourself. You have to be in nature. So if you think that you've got an attachment, you have to suddenly take on a regime, a routine, a disciplined routine of inner work, inner observation, inner purification. You can't be eating, drugs, alcohol, anything that's too stimulating, right? Because that clouds the view, and you have to really go inward. Because the only way to really cleanse that is to remove the root of what is allowing that entity to attach to you. So you have to heal a trauma. And every time you heal a trauma, something will detach spiritually from you. Okay, that's the shamanic and spiritual view of many times emotional disorders, of thought disorders, things like that. They're associated spiritually with interference often. Not because the entity is creating that problem in you, but because we have an imbalance within us, a trauma that needs to be healed, which creates like a break in our aura, and it attracts something that represents that trauma to us, and it magnifies it over time. And we have to rise up and cast it out. And that casting out is also symbolic of the healing of that trauma and building our will and building our power over our mind and our being. David Taylor, what country are the writing archives of Jesus Christ buried? Well, I can tell you that the archives of Jesus Christ are within your heart. And at no point, when it comes to Christian initiation, true Christian initiation that deals with the Christ being and Jesus, at no point is that ever going to be understood or known or interacted with based on writing, based on documents, based even on words. The whole thing about the Christ being is that it can only be known through interacting directly with it spiritually. That's the reality of that stream. So it doesn't matter really what, at the end of the day, like there are things that you can know about the Christ, about Jesus, but there is going to be no true initiatory impulse from documents that are found. There's going to be no revelations from documents that are found. The revelation of Christ is the communion with him and the wisdom and the love and the alchemical change that happens to your mind and your emotions and your being when in union with him. So this is also a very lunar, like pre kind of way where we think that like knowledge is going to initiate us. Like I just have to read enough books, or I just have to have the gnosis, my own self-knowledge of myself, or enough knowledge about Jesus, or enough knowledge about initiation. And it's a lower mental activity that's disguising itself as a spiritual activity. The lower mind cannot initiate you. The lower mind can only be given the correct structure through truth in order to lift you higher into the spiritual world, which can initiate you. So the whole point of basically working with the Christ being is actually, to be ironic here, is actually releasing everything that you think you know about it and directly communing with that. Religion is supposed to be transcendental. It's incredible how much spirituality has become a mental exercise, as though you can debate yourself into a relationship with God, as though the spiritual world has ever made logical sense. It has not. So how we communicate with the Christ being, right, with God, is through inner communion. And we have to go through the process of healing in order to do that. So and the reason why I'm pushing back on this is because one of the things that I've seen that we'll confront in the future is this idea that these records are discovered, and they're discovered, somewhere in the Middle East or in a cave somewhere or on the moon or on Mars or whatever. And these records completely rewrite the story of Christ. They completely rewrite our worldview, our idea of creation. And instead of just connecting with Jesus, connecting with Christ, connecting with God, we think that we have to go to some intellectual analysis and we have to know this or that. And the whole time it's a distraction to basically remove the glory of Christ. It's just trying to redefine creation and turn Jesus into a normal man, which removes resurrection from your lexicon and removes the reference for building the immortal body from your lexicon. So this idea of finding these buried records that rewrites religion and finally reveals the mysteries of all these things is a con. Because when you really want to get into understanding spirituality, initiation science, Christ, the Buddha, it ain't going to be in a book. It's not going to be in writing. Okay, the writing, the sacred text can point you in the right direction. Okay, they can provide the right structure, and they can be written by initiates to the point that just by holding it or reading it, you receive a certain attunement. That's possible. And that's miraculous. That's incredible. That is possible. But that is just the preparation in which we receive to genuinely connect with these forces ourselves, which is required for us, which was required of us to move forward in our own development, is to directly connect with Christ, with Jesus. So I don't much care, to be honest with you, what is dug up in the next 10, 5, 15 years about anyone, because that's not where the initiating principle comes from. It comes from within us, not an external record. And again, I'm hard on this because this is something that I've seen happening and that different people have hinted at is going to happen, and it's a con. So, not that this is what David Taylor is saying or anything. I don't think that this person is really trying to do that. But for me, I think we have to be on the lookout for these archives that are discovered that basically redefine our idea of Jesus, redefine our idea of religion and creation. That's something that I think is on the horizon. Anything written is a way in, but it's not the thing, right? The thing is in here. And that's what it has to be. And that's where you have to work with it if you want to evolve at all. All the stuff that's material is just hoping to get you here, to get you to that place, really. Yeah. Okay, this next question is from Kate. Is the perspective that our ancestors had on eclipses still ripe for our time? Is it an extension from Atlantean times? Steiner says that we are in an age of Michael. Is it right then to be fearless and face the eclipse as Michael faces the shadow? I like that. I like that. Michael is the great solar angel, the great solar archangel who casts the serpent of the lower centers down underneath his feet. And so he's the warrior angel. So yes, I think that the cosmological event is objective. So an eclipse is an eclipse is an eclipse. Summertime is summertime. Wintertime is wintertime. The equinox is the equinox. The solstice is the solstice. Um, the breath of Brahma is the breath of Brahman. So by that meaning, time is time. And then where the subjectivity comes in is that human beings have their own interpretation of these things based on how much they can see, and the kind of perception they have. So in earlier periods, Rudolf Steiner describes humanity as being highly clairvoyant and having a kind of picture consciousness. And so they would see the eclipses as animals interacting with basically the sun and the moon. They'd see, the soul was seen as a bird, right? As the Bennu bird, as the butterfly. And all these different sort of actions within their beings were symbolized by animals. And so there was a very rich symbolic lunar language of pictures and archetypes that we naturally used in earlier periods of our development. Now we're in the age of science, where we're individuals, we have this mind that has developed to be able to perceive things objectively. So in earlier periods, especially in Atlantis, most human beings could not perceive things objectively. So that part of the mind had not developed. That part of the mental organ was not operating that way. That doesn't happen within the mind until many recapitulations later. So the eclipse was still happening as an objective thing because the sun exists and the moon exists and the earth exists. But our perception of it was through symbols, because we did not yet have an objective mind in which to perceive it scientifically or objectively. So you do see quite a difference between earlier civilizations, even going back to ancient Greece, and still having this picture consciousness, this archetypal consciousness. And then you move forward into our period where you see us going so far into objectivity, right? So far into like materialism that we don't even see the spirit anymore. So I think part of the age of where we are, of Michael, is to confront that reality within ourselves and to get to the other side and return to clairvoyance. But when we come into our clairvoyance now, in our era, in the future, we come into it as an individual, whereas before we had a kind of collective clairvoyance in a kind of hive mind. So now when we come back into our clairvoyance, or the world of imagination, as Rudolf Steiner would say, the world of pictures and archetypes that symbolize the spirit. Now we come back into that as an individual, which in our form, we did not have earlier. We were not individuals yet. We were clairvoyant, but we were not individuals. So now we come into the clairvoyance again, but as an individual wielding that clairvoyance, either morally or immorally, which is why morality becomes absolutely paramount in building these higher bodies that we are to exist in our future, in spiritual life. Because once we develop that I is only furthered through moral action and ethics, right? Because it's so powerful. So that is also part of the Michael mystery, is how to wield the I. The I is the sword as well. So part of that is very important, because only through moral life can we face our darkest impulses and transform them into the substrate that builds our higher body, in which we will inhabit our mortal body. So this is a whole different arc of development than humanity has existed in. For the last 2,000 years, something has been possible for humanity that was not possible 3,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 5 million years ago. Requires something different from us, which is a moral life. We have to develop morality if we are to move forward, which is also one of the great lessons of Michael and the Michael age. That's what makes you fierce, actually. Okay. The best way to face, your shadow is through your virtues, which is living ethically and developing morals. That's the way you face a shadow within you. That's the way you rebuild yourself. Because the definition of what gives us a shadow, what makes us evil, is immorality. That's what causes all darkness in the world, selfishness. So when you develop selflessness with morality and ethics and the virtues, then you automatically rise out of these lower states of consciousness that keep us trapped. If that makes sense. Okay, this question is from Paulette. The gateway of death. Please discuss what happens to the physical body prior to entering this gateway, as we cross it, after we leave it. What determines where we go in the spirit world? We do not all go to the same place, do we? Okay, so all souls are subject to the same process. The process is kind of universal, but it's experienced differently depending on your level of development, essentially. So what happens to the body prior to entering death is basically the physical body really isn't alive unless the etheric body is feeding into it. And the etheric body really isn't alive unless the astral body is feeding into it. And part of the astral body is also yet an even higher body, which is called the causal body or the mental body, which is part of the astral body, which is feeding into the etheric body, which is feeding into the physical body. So basically, these are called the etheric sheath, the astral sheath, the higher bodies. They make up the aura. But it's actually a very... it's actually a system of different bodies that are interfacing with your physical body and part of your physical body, but have a different quality. And they're connected to a different plane of development, really. Like the etheric bodies typically seen in the etheric plane, the astral body, the astral plane, and so on. So basically, when you pass away, your body begins to separate from your etheric body begins to separate from your physical body. This can take up to a few minutes for an advanced soul to a few weeks for someone who is not integrated yet. And this is where you get the idea of like the wraith or the ghost standing above the graveyard, above the body. And this is one of the reasons why cremation was brought into focus, was to basically prevent the wraith or prevent the ghost from hanging around the physical body because it's having a hard time separating from it. Also to prevent certain kinds of black magic that could be done to bodies that still have their wraith or their etheric body attached to it, but that's another story. And so once the soul, we'll basically call it the soul, but it's basically the astral body and the eye encased in the etheric body, that basically goes through the physical body, through the heart and up through the head, and dissolves into the essentially etheric world, which is the space between the moon and the earth. Here, there's a process of sort of further disintegration. The body at that point is gone. It's died. There's nothing attached to it. And then you go up and you go to, in the Eastern tradition, it's called Kamaloka, but it's also considered to be the moon realm. And this is like where you feel all of your desires, basically. And so if you have a ton of attachments to the material world and you were trying to work out all of your issues materially and in your lower centers, this is where you feel all of those desires 10, 20, 30 fold. So this is the idea of like hell and purgatory, is that for some people who do not come to understand their lower nature, and they develop all these attachments and desires, the moment they no longer have a physical form, it's incredibly painful. And so they sort of stay in this, in the Eastern system, it's like they talk about it being I think they talk about it in temperature, but they talk about it being like the burning desire realm. Some people who have worked their entire life on not having attachments and living morally, they don't really experience much here, except for like they may have like this desire to eat. They may miss eating, they may miss certain physical things, but it's not like this burning desire that you have if you're really entrenched in materialism. It's extremely painful for people who cannot sort out what's going on in their lower centers. And that's where that idea of hell and purgatory and stuff comes in, is like it's completely based on the quality of substrate within your lower centers, your desires, and where you're placing them in your life. This is why spiritual orders would talk about like abstaining from different addictions, from material life. It wasn't about like I'm more pure than you or control of people. It was that when you pass away, if you do not purify your lower centers, then when you cross over, all of that will come to tenfold, and you'll burn in your desires. Now, why that happens is that we have to understand why. We have to understand what grows us and what devolves us. So we have to, as souls, very, very, very potently feel dark and light in order for us to reincarnate, understand our life, and make a change. So that's why it's so intense. And the whole time, obviously, prayers help and there's beings around that help, but it's basically you're experiencing yourself out of your body. You're experiencing the quality of your own mind and desires. So that is sort of like, it's not that about going to the same place, it's that the process is the same. We go through the same gates, the same corridors, the same compressions, which are represented in the planetary spheres. But we don't all experience it the same way based on your spiritual evolution. And there's certain ways you can live your life in which that process becomes easier and easier. And there's certain ways you can live your life which makes your death process very difficult for you, which is where the idea of like heaven and hell and second death comes in. Does that make sense? Eventually, all soul essences rise into like the higher, what Rudolf Steiner would call Devachan, or the Eastern system would call Devachan, or the higher heavens. Eventually, there'll be some soul substrate that does return there and comes back around again. But also, it depends on how much of this astral etheric sheath is left there of karma for you to put on when you come back down. So the whole death process is fascinating. We should probably do like a series on that at some point. But, in 15 minutes or less, that's death. That's the best I could do. Okay, this next question is from a member. And you said, does the capitalist paradigm that we find ourselves in engender narcissism, exploitation, division, and atomization of society? Well, I don't think we have like true capitalism in the way in which some people who have written about capitalism have described it. I think that we have basically crony capitalism, which is a false illusion of capitalism, when in reality, we don't have an open system of merit and free trade. We have the illusion of it. So I don't actually think we live in a capitalist system. I think we live in an oligarchy. I think we live in a system that is controlled essentially by small few. And I think that's very obvious. We do not live in a society that's based in merit. We live in a society that's based in nepotism, that's based in greed. And I think that there have been idealists and noble minds that have tried to fight for a better system, but our system is corrupt. And so the reason why it's corrupt isn't because of laws or any external system. I think the reason why it's corrupt is because humanity is. And I think that humanity is very much asleep on certain issues, which allows this darkness to take over any kind of political system that's put in place. Darkness can enter anything, right? But like, narcissism is a soul problem. So if somebody is narcissistic, that's a soul problem. There are people that can be exposed to the same event in life, and some people will become a narcissist and others will not. So narcissism and certain disorders in the personality are a spiritual issue that have to be solved through spiritual means. And I think that there could be definitely a better structure set up that I think would, and I think this is where you're going with this, and I completely agree, which is that I do think that a better system could be set up that for individuals who are on the edge, that could perhaps go either way. It could definitely encourage them to go a higher way. I do believe that there can be compassionate systems that are set up that encourage that, because I think what you're getting at here is that the world and the way that it's set up is not serving people who are really on the fence, or people who are in a position of vulnerability mentally and emotionally, right? I don't think our system's serving those people that could maybe go either way. I think that there are some people that no matter what system they're in, they're going to be a narcissist. That's just where they are in their development. There's also going to be people that no matter what system they're in, they're going to be like a, holy figure. Doesn't matter what external pressure, what system they're in, they're going to be a good person because the soul is organized as such. There's going to be people, no matter what system it is, that are going to behave cruelly because that is how their soul is organized. But I do think we can set up a system that's much more noble, much more compassionate, much more spiritual, not in a cult way, but in a real way, that encourages people who are unawake and unaware to live in a better way. I do absolutely agree with that. But I think ultimately, we do have to come down to the individual with this as well. Because I don't really think we have like the true idea of capitalism. I think it's mainly just a bunch of people have absorbed power and wealth and money into themselves, and they pretend like we live in this free world where the harder you work, the more you can achieve. That's fair and merit-based, when we clearly don't live that way. We're living in some bizarre, oligarchy. That's really what we have more than anything. I'm not, and I'm not a political scientist, but that's the way I see it. Okay, last question, and then we're going to do some shout outs. And by the way, I am here doing this on my private platform every second Sunday. We do this and I just take your questions. I absolutely love it. So if you like this, do consider going over there and supporting my work and signing up. That's what allows me to do all of my free content on YouTube. Okay, last question, and then we're going to get into super chats and shout outs. Okay, this is from a member. Would you say that behind our identity, name, nationality, race, and age, the loving awareness within everyone and everything is God? Is that why meditation and taming our mind is so important? How do you perceive the character of God in the Bible? What a beautiful question to end on today. Yeah. Yes. The loving awareness within everyone and everything is God. It is what we stemmed from. It is what we are made of, and it is the unifying force between all things, all beings. We all share it. So everything is God in different aspects, different phases of development, different states of matter, ether, or spirit. And it's important to remember that, because so easily we can get caught up in what makes us different. And as soon as we start to get caught up in what makes us different in our own mind, really soon we start to create these weird false hierarchies and prejudice, and we start living in this weird way. But it's so good to come back to the reality that we are all part of God, and that God is within us. And that the greatest joy in life is to learn to understand that and live with that as your operational truth. That is what creates joy, growth, is living with that as the center of your reality. And yes, we meditate in order to turn off or kind of get our mind to relax enough that we can sense that truth within ourselves. Because our mind will just be reactionary. It'll just repeat whatever we've thought before. It'll try to protect us when we're not needing it. So the mind actually has to be tempered by the will. And so meditation allows us to do that. It allows us to it's not so much about controlling the mind through meditation. It's not about control. It's about tempering the mind with our will, which is united with God or with Christ. So it's really more about becoming aware of ourselves, of our inner essence, right? And then aligning or attuning that inner essence with God, with Christ. That is the secret. You have to realize it's there, learn to feel that essence within you, and then attune it to the highest force in the cosmos. And that's what creates that upliftment. That's what creates that upwards alchemy, is that attunement, right? So the first part of meditation and self-realization is realizing that you're a divine being, realizing that you're eternal, realizing that you have a soul. But the last phase is attuning your soul to the higher, to a being higher than yourself, which is Christ. So that is the last leg, symbolized by the rising out of the tomb, is that attunement. So self-realization through meditation is important, but also attuning ourselves with the higher worlds, with Christ, is important, because that's what creates that resonance that lifts us, if that makes sense. So it's like just realizing it's there is just the beginning. Then comes the attunement of that essence with something higher than yourself, with your angel, with Christ, God. You need that attunement in order to lift, right? Discovery first, then the attunement. And then through the attunement, we realize we become more and more attuned by right living, or by living ethically, living morally, living compassionate, that accelerates it. So that's the real secret. And meditation is the practice that allows us to see, how far along we are in that. And sometimes we think we're a lot farther along than we are, and then we come into an argument or something negative, and we're like, oh my gosh, I thought I was a lot further. And then sometimes through meditation and self-work, we realize, oh my God, I had so much composure in that moment. Or, oh my gosh, I feel nothing but love for this person that hurt me. Or, oh my God, I feel nothing but compassion in this moment that before I would have felt so much anger. And so it's through that self-examination that we realize how far along we are in this process. So I think we will end it there. And the character of God in the Bible is the true character of God. But in the Bible, God is kind of portrayed in different ways as a reflection of where humanity is spiritually at that time. But God is essentially the ultimate love and the ultimate knowledge combined. God is that spark of essence that is within all of us that we are challenged to make like him through attuning properly. So thank you guys so much for joining me today. It's been my absolute pleasure to connect with you. I'm going to read out the shout outs and then I'm going to be on my merry way. Super chat shout outs. Thank you so much for the support. Dario Darkangelo, K Grace Healing. Thank you so much. Ramadasa. Thank you. Deadpool Kid. Thank you so much. Eyes All Around. Felipe. Thank you. Kitten Magic. I like that. Blooming Soul, Blooming SOL, Blooming Sun, Blooming Soul. Norman Smith, Darko Anti-Flank. Thank you guys so much. I hope you had a wonderful Easter. I will be right back here probably either next week or the week after on YouTube. Again, I will be doing this all over again on Sunday with you, this Sunday, which is pretty soon actually, on my private platform. So if you like this, do consider joining that. There's also an incredible community of members with forums where topics like this are discussed. It's a great place for support and communication and to really, I think, have deep, meaningful conversations that aren't under the glare of social media and things like that. So we have a really great platform over there. Do check it out if you haven't. And I will leave you to the rest of your Wednesday afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me.